Simon Wiesenthal once said, "For evil to flourish, it only requires that good men do nothing." But is that true? Perhaps. Sounds like it's time for episode 102 of Pop Art, where we find the pop culture in art and the art in pop culture. It's the podcast where my guest chooses a movie from popular culture, and I'll select a film from the more art classic indie side of cinema with a connection to it. I am your Forget It Jake, It's Chinatown host, Howard Casner. Today, I am happy to welcome as my guest, producer and writer and chairman of Here Media Inc., Stephen Jarchow, who has chosen as his film the new Hollywood neo-noir Chinatown. I have chosen the classic British noir, The Third Man, both films about people investigating a murder only to find out just how deep evil and corruption can run. Before beginning, I do want to encourage my listeners to follow, like, or comment on the podcast. I want to know what you think. So to begin, Stephen, why don't you tell our audience something about yourself?
I was born in Madison, Wisconsin, went to law school and business school at the University of Wisconsin, practiced law for 5 years, doing corporate real estate. For a number of years, I was a partner in a large real estate company. Enjoyed films, studied film, tried to learn as much as I could because I'd always had an interest since I started watching James Bond in the 1960s and went to films at the university. I was head of real estate for an investment firm. And then in 1990, went off on my own and started investing in a variety of businesses, acted as an advisor to companies and governments in the Middle East and other parts of the world. But during this time, again, I'm interested in film, so I taught entertainment law at Southern Methodist University in years because a good way to try to learn something is to teach it. I met my business partner, Paul Kalishman, and we formed a number of different companies, including Reach Entertainment and ultimately Here Media. Paul and I have produced together over 150 pictures and TV series. We've had 2 films win Academy Awards, the most notable being Gods and Monsters, and then Departures, which won the Academy Best Foreign in 2000. Most recently, have focused a group of companies we own which specialize in streaming services and other products for the gay audience. Paul's gay. We make a very good team. I have a daughter who's gay. We've sort of grown up with this business and have become somewhat competent in providing content to that market. And it's been, of the businesses we own together right now, it's probably the most successful. We've been nominated, Paul and I, for 5 Emmys. We won one in 2021 for Girls' Voices Now. It won in children's programming, and it's about challenges faced by young women of color in Los Angeles. And we gave a variety of women age and demographic cameras and then supervised them when told the story of their lives and broke through and got us our first Emmy. We continue to run our networks and streaming services, continue to make shows both for the network and other buyers. I'll keep doing it as long as I can.
Well, you certainly sound like you've led an exciting life. With that, let's go to your selection, and that is Chinatown. First, some information about the film. Chinatown is an American neo-noir released in 1974. It was directed by Roman Polanski and written by Robert Towne. It stars Jack Nicholson, Faye Dunaway, John Huston, Perry Lopez, John Hillerman, Daryl Swirling, Diane Ladd, Roy Jensen, Roman Polanski, Dick Bacallion, Joe Mantell, Bruce Glover, James O'Rear, James Hong, Jerry Fujikawa, Belinda Palmer, Roy Roberts, Rance Howard, Alan Warnick, and Burt Young. In 1937, the wealthy Mrs. Mulray hires private detective J.J. Gittes to get the goods on her husband. When it turns out that his client isn't the real Mrs. Mulray, and the husband turns up dead, he becomes embroiled in a mystery concerning the wealthy Noah Cross, incest, corruption, and water rights for the San Fernando Valley. Before talking about the film proper, I would like to cover one topic first. In both of these films, we have 2 of the greatest screen villains of all time. They are charming, personable, full of life, everything the good characters are. But they are sociopathic and have no real moral values at all. We wouldn't want to have dinner with them except through the distance of a movie screen. What do you think is the particular appeal of these types of films and characters, this fascination we have for evil?
I think that everyone, as Noah Cross says, is capable of doing evil. We really don't know until we're confronted with what our boundaries are. And to watch these characters portrayed by two of the greatest screen actors of the time, two men who were both directors and actors, gives us a window into how awful it can be and what we ourselves be capable of under the right set of circumstances. It's fine to do the right thing when you're really not tempted or not given the opportunity, but given the opportunity to make a fortune in the ways that either character does, corrupt, unforgivable fashion. What if we were faced with that opportunity? Would we pursue that course? We don't know.
I think that's very true. Often when I watch villains or people who have a choice as to whether to make the right choice or the wrong choice, I often wonder, what choice would I make? And it's easy from a distance to say we'd always make the good choice, but we don't really know. In an article in Greater Good magazine by Elizabeth Svoboda titled "Why We're Obsessed with Understanding Evil," there could be beneficial aspects to this obsession. From an evolutionary perspective, familiarizing yourself with what you fear and dread, like evil, pays survival dividends. Quote, you would pay attention to and have interest in the horrific, writes Penn State psychologist Marissa Harrison, because in the ancestral environment, those who tuned in to horrible events left more descendants, logically because they were able to escape a harmful stimuli. And in a 2010 study of why women were drawn to true crime books, University of Illinois psychologists argued it was at least in part, quote, because of the potential life-saving knowledge gained from reading them. I should note here, I love true crime documentaries. I watch them all the time on Netflix, on HBO, Amazon. There's just something about them I find really fascinating, just to see how evil people can be.
Well, and it gives perspective on the world. Historically, Americans have had sort of a positive view of their life, their country, their government. But then World War II came along, Holocaust, and then more currently, the Manson murders, which had a direct impact. The people, the film, we as Americans began to realize, oh my gosh, there's some pretty unbelievably awful things can take place, and we better understand that.
That is very true, and we'll actually be referring to that as we go along. But you can also add that there is the idea that we have a fantasy of what would it be like to be able to do anything we wanted and get away with it, and that evil is often romanticized on the screen. And sometimes today, we're not really sure who the good guys and the bad guys are. And in art, without evil, where would we be? There wouldn't be any story, there wouldn't be any art.
Well, you need the conflict to have a movie.
Right.
These two villains are incredibly attractive as villains. I think the viewer, on some level, identifies with them. They're doing as.
I think they'd be much more fun to hang out with than Holly Martins or Jake Gittes.
Well, Jay Gittes is a little bit of an anti-hero. For a large part of the movie, you don't know which side morally he fall on, because he tends to be the kind of guy that does what he's to do. But as this thing plays out, decides to take action. It's sometimes ill-advised, and it doesn't get the result. And of course, in the case of Holly Martins, he's sort of overwhelmed by the whole thing throughout.
When did you choose this film?
Like you, I'm always in crime thrillers and film noir. I watch those films as often as I can. They're my particular favorite type of film noir. So it is the type of film I really look forward to seeing. It's based loosely on actual LA history, the water wars. It's a particularly well-made film, and it involves 4 participants who were absolutely at the height of their powers at a moment in time. Jack Nicholson, Robert Towne, Robert Evans, and Polanski. It happened to be in some really good movies. In addition, the screenplay for Towne is generally considered one of the best screenplays ever written at the studio level. The music is extraordinary for this. There's an argument Chinatown would not be Chinatown without the music. You know, the whole concept, good and evil, which you touched on, is just a fascinating notion for the study of film.
When did you first see it?
I saw it in the theater in the 1970s when I was in law school. I think I was on a date. I remember being really impressed and sort of mesmerized Since that time, I've seen it many.
I can't say how many times I've seen this or The Third Man. Probably less than 10, but more than 5. I first saw it when it opened, and I was overwhelmed by it. When I heard the horn honking at the end, I knew what happened before they got to the car, and I was horrified. And I knew what happened because we had this set up earlier with Evelyn Mulwray falling against the horn and honking it. I was becoming a fan of noir, like so many film goers of my generation. Film noir had existed since Maltese Falcon, but it didn't really had its own fan club like it does today. And that fascination developed during the 70s. When I was in college, I think Chinatown is one of the great American films, one of the great world films, perhaps the best written screenplay of any American film, though it does have its faults, as we'll discuss later. People consider it a perfect screenplay, but there are 3 instances where I think it falls short of that, though it doesn't matter. It's a great screenplay that also fit the time period in pop culture terms as well as political and morality terms, as you mentioned. What are some of your favorite scenes?
There's certain dialogue that really resonates. Obviously, the scene where it is revealed Evelyn Mulwray is both the mother and the sister. Mother-sister back and forth is shocking, memorable. When I first saw it, it took me a while to figure out exactly what it was she was saying. Naivete, being raised in the Midwest. We've touched on Noah Cross. Jack Nicholson, J.J. Getty, asks him, what else can you buy? Why do you want more money? And he says, the future. He's the future. I kind of love every scene John Huston is in because he's so obviously evil, but also so smooth, has so little conscience that you just find him unique characters. And then, of course, the Forget It, Jake, It's Chinatown is the kind of ending that sticks with you a long time. And it also has become sort of catchphrase for a situation where you really do not know what's going on. Things are beyond your power, or forces that you do not control or understand. One scene, kind of an action scene that really find is when Jack Nicholson is trying to figure out what's happening with the water. All of a sudden, the water is rushing down, and he tries to scramble out of there, succeeds in scrambling up the fence and over the fence. And it's a very impressive bit of gymnastics by Jack Nicholson at the time when he was thin, incredibly agile, and that's quickly followed. Roman Polanski, the man with the knife, the director of the film, slits Nicholson's nose. I could probably cite 24 other scenes too.
Yes, that is certainly true, and those are some great scenes. I love the early setup of the glass scene with the Japanese gardener. One scene that really worked for me was at the nursing home when he has to get away from the thugs. And suddenly Evelyn Mulwray comes racing by in her car and he jumps on the car. And for some reason, the movie really came together for me at that point. I don't know whether it was the rush of the car just creating adrenaline in me, or this took the emotion in the story a step higher since it showed the change in relationship in Jake and Evelyn. They were now more or less partners, and after this become lovers.
I agree with you. That is sort of a tipping point.
I also have this favorite line, which we'll talk about later, and that is when Evelyn Mulwray says that she has a flaw in the iris in her eye. I always thought that was a very important line in the movie. But the director is Roman Polanski. What do you think of him, and do you have a favorite film of his?
This is my favorite film of his.
Of course.
Knife in the Water is the great art film, I think has been influential on all kinds of thrillers. Of course, Rosemary's Baby is one of the truly great horror films. The way that Polanski changed that film from sort of a supernatural film to more of a mystery and practical thriller was really quite brilliant. It made it scarier, I think. I would say those are my favorite, the many films he made.
Well, where do you rate Roman Polanski as a filmmaker?
As a filmmaker, I think he is almost unparalleled. This is a director who truly understood and understands all aspects of the filmmaking process. He was as good a cinematographer as probably any cinematographer he ever worked. He was very conscious, set design and set decoration, very detail-oriented, very particular. He was also very good at costume design. With respect to dealing with actors, he and Nicholson were friends. He was able to make that work, although at one point he'd get upset with Nicholson from a basketball game, tore his TV apart. And of course, dealing with Faye Dunaway was difficult, and Faye was going through her very touchy star phase. Paul Kalishman know Faye later on, a movie with her, for us at least, was incredibly gracious, thoughtful. At one point presented us with an award, and Paul was giving the speech, and she reached over and held my hand. That was a really nice Hollywood moment.
Well, I agree that Roman Polanski is definitely one of the great filmmakers of the new Hollywood. For me, his reputation rests on the series of films he made with Knife in the Water and ending with Chinatown, which was the last film he made in the U.S. Once he fled to the U.S. and went into exile, I personally found his films to be less and less interesting, mainly because they were just unworthy of his talent. He was not doing the kinds of films that I think he should be doing based on what he had done before. He wasn't able to raise them above what they were. And I think part of this was because he didn't have the money and the backing of American studios, which he was used to. He did one successful one with Tess, which doesn't work for me because even though the Natasha Kinski was given diction lessons for months on end, she still couldn't come close to having the right accent, and she was never a very good actress. The exceptions for me are The Pianist and Venus in Furs, and I haven't been able to see An Officer and a Spy. Others disagree with me, and they really try to find the greatness of Polanski in these films he made once he was exiled. But for me, he sort of lost, for the most part, the ability that he had when he first rose to fame.
I think you really articulate well. Frankly, you asked the question, grasping, what do I like about him and what don't I like? And I think you're right. I personally don't like the films he made after Chinatown, now a long time ago, after he fled the U.S. because of the scandal. And of course, I'm sure Polanski was influenced by the events of his life and what he wanted to do and what he could do.
You're right about his life influencing him. Polanski knew how to bring out the evil and corruption in film stories. He survived the Nazis in Poland as a child by being sent from place to place and by hiding out. One time he was at a church home where he was instructed in Catholicism, though he was never baptized, in order for him to blend in. He grew up in the communist takeover of Poland. He was finally able to leave, one reason because he had dual citizenship in France. And then he has the Sharon Tate murders. But with that background, it's easy to see why his films are filmed with paranoia and cruelty and violence, evil. Polanski and Nicholson had been looking for a project to work on together, and Chinatown had been written specifically with Nicholson in mind. It was an unwieldy script of 180 pages. But many people saw the potential, especially Robert Evans, and he wanted Polanski because it gave a European feel. And at this time, the French New Wave and existentialism was transforming Hollywood. Polanski was reluctant to come back because it was only a few years after the murder of Sharon Tate, but he did. Polanski helped Town shape the script, though there was a lot of acrimony there. Polanski helped get rid of a lot of subplots and was responsible for the ending, which was different from Town's, which we will talk more about later. But it might be noted that there is an irony here. One of Noah Cross's many sins is that he had sex with his 15-year-old daughter. Polanski had sex with a 13-year-old teen, and he basically got away with it. And he still considers himself a victim. Maybe all that's inside of him about that is what helped him get into the darkness of this story.
Well, it's interesting because Noah Cross doesn't blame himself
right.
for what happened. What's kind of interesting, Polanski, I'm not sure it was Town or Polanski, but they don't treat this as a rape. Jack Nicholson asks Faye Dunaway, says, you were raped. And she, a very interesting bit of acting, basically says, no, it was consensual. Of course, a father-daughter relationship is a power dynamic, screams rape.
And she was 15 at the time, so it doesn't matter whether she agreed or not. It's statutory rape, no matter what.
But it's interesting, he doesn't consider it, at least in terms of response, which is bizarre. That may play into Polanski's subconscious, maybe consistent with what happened to him later on.
Well, that was, in many ways, the zeitgeist of the time. In a previous podcast, I talked about the sexualizing of teenagers in movies at the time,
right.
Especially women who did nudity even though they were underage, or did sex scenes, not explicit, but for the time. And somehow Hollywood didn't even look at this as outrageous.
Yep.
Sometimes I was surprised that they didn't. But today, you would never be able to get away with that. The screenplay is by Robert Towne. Again, how do you feel about Robert Towne? Do you have a favorite film of his?
This is my favorite film of his, and I think it's his best work. Robert Towne's a character, very much a product of that time. And he worked closely with his very good friend, Taylor. They lived together on and off again. And even when Towne was in a relationship, he was always really close to Taylor. In fact, one of his girlfriends said, Robert was never really in love with anyone. He was really in love with Taylor. I've always sort of wondered the relationship beyond being a buddy. There was something going on. Edward Taylor was actually a professor, I think, at USC, or a lecturer, professor. Really helped Robert on quite a bit on structure, and also was incredibly knowledgeable with respect to human behavior. Towne never gave Taylor real credit, but he acknowledged contribution. And then in Robert Towne's life, he was also very influenced and assisted by the female relationship. Early on, a relationship with Barry Chase, who was a dancer and actress. She was, I think, the one that suggested to him the possibility of the incest storyline, because not she personally, her half-sister and stepfather were found in bed together by detectives working for her mother. What you find is that Robert Towne based a lot of things in his screenplays on his personal history and that of his friends and that of people he knew. His other relationship during was with Julie Payne, who was a child of Hollywood. Her father was John Payne, the actor, and her mother was an actress as well. Julie Payne did the research, the water war, and the concept of the criminal behavior that took place in earlier 1930s when this film is based, but sort of laid the groundwork for the whole story, the mystery much more real and tangible. Towne, we went through draft after draft after draft, particularly with this one. I think what was the shooting script. You can see where Polanski cut material out in order to make the film, and he may even have shot some of it included. In my reaction, these choices, Polanski, probably pretty good one, made the script into a better movie and created sort of this legendary status for the script.
Well, sometimes what makes a writer is not the writer, but his editor.
That's an excellent point.
As many have said, this is considered perhaps to be the best American screenplay. I sort of go back and forth between All About Eve and Chinatown. Depends on the time of day. But for me, his reputation rests really on 3 movies, and that's The Last Detail, Shampoo, and Chinatown, though I like personal best very much. Like Polanski, something happened after Chinatown, and he never quite reached this height again. He was also known as the script doctor, and a lot of people champion his screenplay for Mission Impossible, which I thought was perfectly fine. But he was one of the writers, along with Paul Schrader, influenced the new Hollywood and its focus on corruption, paranoia, hypocrisy, existentialism. They drove the new Hollywood for about 20 so years when postmodernism came in. The history is that in 1971, producer Robert Evans offered Towne $175,000 to adapt The Great Gatsby. But Towne didn't think he could do any better than the novel, so Towne made a deal with Evans for $25,000 to write his own story, Chinatown, and he wrote it with Jack Nicholson in mind. And he took the title and the exchange, What Did You Do in Chinatown, as little as possible, from a Hungarian vice cop who had worked in Los Angeles' Chinatown. The officer thought that, quote, police were better off in Chinatown doing nothing because you could never tell what went on there, unquote. And that's because everybody was speaking different dialects. The police didn't speak any Chinese of any kind. And you didn't know who the bad guys were. You didn't know who was exploiting who. And if you tried to help, sometimes you made it worse. Polanski cut the narration by Gittes and filmed the story so the audience and Gittes unraveled the mysteries at the same time. And every scene is seen from Gittes' point of view. But then we come to the ending, which to some degree has become a myth. Originally, what I heard was that Towne's ending had Evelyn, Jake, and her daughter making it to Mexico. And I think that's what Pauline Kael said. The town denied this and said that, quote, the way I'd seen it was that Evelyn would kill her father but end up in jail for it, unable to give the real reason why it happened. And the detective couldn't talk about it either, so it was bleak in its own way. Town later concluded that, quote, Roman was right, that the stark and simple ending, due to the complexity of the story coming before, worked better than his own, which he said was, quote, too complicated and too literary.
I think I would have, from the standpoint of wanting a happy ending, happy with the other end. I really understand that it came out this way. Certainly is consistent with Polanski's worldview that he recently experienced his pregnant mother killed by the Nazis years earlier. In Polanski's view, needed to die.
Evil triumphs, Satan wins. In Rosemary's Baby, in Macbeth, violence is just a way of changing whoever is ruling, and that's all it means. Polanski said, quote, I knew that A Chinatown must be special, not just another thriller where the good guys triumph in the final reel. Evelyn had to die. And this sort of suggests that actually the original ending where Mulray, Evelyn, Jake, and the daughter get away to Mexico was the original one, because in Town's version, bad guy doesn't get away with it, but neither does Evelyn.
Well, it's interesting because Town, in many ways, if you look at his screenplays, tends to be very much a traditionalist in terms of his structures and his beginnings, middles, and ends. So it's not surprising that semi-happy ending to this relentlessly challenging movie. But Polanski prevailed, as you point out, properly so.
So here I want to divert a little and talk about a documentary, Los Angeles Plays Itself, by Tom Anderson. Have you seen this?
I have. It's been a while, but I have.
I've seen it like 4 times. I love this film. And I've covered this on the show before. One of the themes or one of the theses in it is that Anderson claims that LA's reputation as corrupt, or in my words, the film noir capital of the world, rests on a series of movies that people believe are based on fact when they are not. And the first is Who Framed Roger Rabbit, in which it is claimed a corrupt city council backed by oil and car companies destroyed public transportation to build roads. And this is not true. The citizens of Los Angeles voted on the bond issue. They greatly supported it. During World War II, the public transportation system was focused on getting people to the war plants. No need for that once the war ended. The public transportation was outdated and not popular, and more people were buying cars. The next is LA Confidential, which dramatizes the LA Police Department as getting rid of organized crime and taking it over themselves. In addition, there's a council member extorted into changing his vote on freeway bond, which would have been unnecessary. They would have had the votes. So none of this was true. And then we have Chinatown, which claims that the San Fernando Valley was turned from farms to part of LA because of stolen water and buying land cheap, with Mulray a stand-in for Mulholland. This never happened. Something similar happened, as you called it, the California Water Wars, at the beginning of the 20th century, around 1905, where Mulholland and Frederick Eaton wanted to expand Los Angeles. To do that, they needed water, which LA didn't have. So through some pretty unethical methods, they acquired an aqueduct from the Owens Valley. Eaton took the opportunity to buy up land as the land started drying up from lack of water. But this is not how the valley became part of LA. However, people actually believe this, that this actually happened. As Anderson says, quote, these echoes have led many viewers to regard Chinatown not only as docudrama, but as truth, the real secret history of how Los Angeles got its water, and has become a ruling metaphor of the non-fictional critiques of Los Angeles development, unquote. The myth is more powerful than the truth, but I also think it's kind of fun that we're the film noir capital of the U.S. because of all these myths, and not because it's really true.
I would argue perhaps that LA was the film noir capital in the late 40s and 50s before some of these movies came about. And most of those stories at that time based in any particular history, quasi-history. But I do like the notion that you've drawn from these pictures that when people see a movie, they assume that that's the history. And that is the version of history is imprinted because not as many people read or study or try to understand the nuances. They, something straightforward and fairly simple. We're seeing in our time, social media, a lot of disinformation, an extreme version of kind of that same phenomenon.
As we said, many people consider this a perfect screenplay. However, party pooper than I am, and I always am, that's why people invite me sometimes on these things, is that I think there are some flaws. And they don't necessarily stand out unless you've seen the film a number of times. One is the phone call from Ida Sessions telling Jake to look in the obituary. The motivation Sessions gives for this is pretty weak. Oh, she just doesn't want anybody to think that she's part of all this. But I'm going, well, you know about the obituaries, and we don't know how you know about that. But at any rate, that's pretty weak. It's just a method of keeping the plot going. The second one is the shooting at the end. First of all, the policeman shoots a gun in the air. And I'm going, you people better scatter. Who knows where that bullet's going to come down in a crowd? It's going to kill somebody. So usually you just don't shoot it straight up in the air. But more important, he's shooting at a car that is way down the road that has an innocent person in it. And you just don't do that because you might hit the innocent person. But it's so horrifying that you don't think that. I mean, you just forget about how ridiculous it is for this policeman to shoot.
And it's really ridiculous because Mulray, Faye Dunaway, shoots at point blank range her father and doesn't kill him, shoots him in the arm or something. It's vague.
Not very good.
And then the second shot from the policeman that kills her, as you correctly, is an impossible shot.
Right. But Town didn't write this part of it. Roman Polanski wrote this part because Town had left by the time this happened. But the main one is the confrontation between Gittes and Noah Cross, where he goes and makes accusation. And I know that these glasses, the bifocals, are yours and that you lost them when you killed Mulray in the saltwater pond. There is no reason for Gittes to do this. There is no real motivation. The only way it furthers the plot is he's basically told Noah Cross, oh, your daughter is taking your daughter out of the country. But there's actually no reason for this confrontation. There's nothing he's going to get from Cross that he doesn't already know. But you also don't realize that because it's an incredibly well-written scene.
You are so right about that.
Perhaps the greatness of a screenplay or a work of art is that it makes you forget the flaws in it.
A couple of things sort of bothered me, teeny tiny nuance, and I'm not sure I'm right about either, and they have nothing to do with any fact that they didn't make any sense, was when Evelyn Mulray comes in to hire Gittes to find what happened to Hollis. He basically listens to her. They arrive at a deal. Then he phones on the intercom his secretary and says, draw up our standard contract without telling her any of the details of that contract whatsoever. She comes in with a contract and he gives it to her to sign. And I realized as a lawyer, you got to tell your secretary what the points of the deal is. It makes no sense. And
I mean, you would have blank spaces for certain aspects of it, and you would fill those blank spaces in, like so much per hour and this and that and that, which wouldn't.
Exactly. Well, unless he was going to fill in all the blanks after she signed.
Right. They never do that.
And the other thing, and again, I'm not sure I'm right about, but after the two of them have been together, Evelyn gets the call, is going to leave and doesn't want to tell Jake what this is about. He puts his pants on and dashes outside, busts one of her taillights so he can follow her more easily. If I have this right, once you see him following her, the taillight has switched. It looks to me like the one he busted, which was on the right-hand side, is now on the left-hand side.
Well, that would be fun if it's true. Actually, a lot of people complain when I point these out, thinking I'm ruining a movie. And I'm actually saying, no, this makes the movie more fun to me.
I agree.
When it comes to the acting, do you have a favorite performance, especially outside of the lead? Because we all know how great Nicholson, Dunaway, and Houston are.
I really like Perry Lopez, who plays Escobar.
Mm-hmm.
I like the character quite a bit. You know, he's not the bungling cop that you see in so many of these movies. He's competent, honest in his way, as Jack Nicholson puts it. He has to swim in the same waters as the rest of us a bit. And I've liked him in other things, too, because he plays heavies and bandits and other things from time to time. And he had a fairly long career. He was also in the sequel, The Two Jakes, where he's made captain. I actually liked the performance by Daryl Zwirling, who plays Huck. I know it's a brief performance, but I like touches, and I found it completely believable. And then, of course, you've got Diane Ladd, Laura Dern's mother, who is also quite believable. I mean, the performances throughout really hit the right note.
Yeah, it's a very well cast film. And you'll recognize a lot of the characters, Burt Young and John Hillerman. I like Diane Ladd's character because you have to feel sorry for her. It's getting on in years. She's an actress because she has a SAG card in her billfold, but so unsuccessful that no one will recognize her as she is hired to play Mrs. Mulray. She's just one of these bit players who's always in the background and never had success as an actress. She did mention Faye Dunaway, and this was not a good shoot for Faye Dunaway. She and Polanski didn't get along at all.
Right.
You're one of the very few people who have ever had anything good to say about Dunaway, because Dunaway suffered from very serious mental and emotional issues, which probably no one knew at the time. And Polanski could be a bit tough and cruel, so it was a combustible pairing. But the women in the film aren't treated well. You mentioned that Evelyn Mulray's character doesn't act like she has been raped. Burt Young's wife shows up with a black eye, and it's used as a joke, not a knock at an abusive husband. Evelyn gets slapped around and ends up with a bullet in her head, and Ida Sessions ends up sprawled dead on her kitchen floor. And this really wasn't all that unusual for the time. There was an undercurrent of misogyny in films, especially during the 70s and 80s, but we still have it a lot today.
You're absolutely right. Pretty much all the women are abused.
And we're not to sort of think of them as being abused so much.
Right.
Cinematography is by John A. Alonso, and certainly he has to be praised for this film.
He was known as a cinematographer that worked very quickly and very receptive to direction, which he had to be because, as we discussed, Polanski was very knowledgeable and kind of knew what he wanted. Originally, I think it was Stanley Cortez.
He was taking too long.
Yeah. He was more of a traditional, slow, not going to work with Polanski, who is, for all his attention to detail and the fact he would take many takes, knew what he wanted and just wanted it done that way. You're quite right. I mean, the cinematography is extraordinary picture. There's image after image that reflects LA, the drought, the undercurrent of corruption, insecurity. It's top notch.
He was really known for pioneering handheld work, lighting technique, and high definition video. So he helped define the look of the new Hollywood, especially with the handheld camera, which was becoming more and more popular and more criticized, as my friends often complained of motion sickness while watching a lot of these films. He started out as an actor, so he knew how to capture and work with actors on film. But he's a very important cinematographer. He's not necessarily considered one of the great cinematographers, and he's primarily known for Chinatown and Scarface. But he was the first American cinematographer of Mexican American and Latino heritage to become a member of the Cinematographers Union of Los Angeles, as well as the first to be inducted into the ASC. And you've already mentioned this, but the music by Jerry Goldsmith.
Well, this was another case. They had another composer, Philip Lambro. Frankly, when they screened the film, I think initially in San Francisco, EGA, and in Los Angeles, the music was jarring, and they did some preview screenings also. The music just wasn't working for anyone, and people really disliked the movie, particularly the industry screen. The reaction was incredibly negative. Robert Evans didn't really know Jerry Goldsmith. He went over to his house and knocked on his door and said, in essence, I need you to save my movie. I think Jerry Goldsmith did that.
Well, I think in both movies, we're going to find out that the music played a very important part in the success of the movie. But Jerry Goldsmith is one of the giants of film music. We've talked about him on my podcast before. He's been noted for his use of unique instrumentation, utilizing a vast array of ethnic instruments, recorded sounds, synthetic textures, traditional orchestra. And here we not only have the said trumpet, we have like a sudden zither-like flow of music and a tinkling piano keys to increase the tension. The trumpet was played by Ewan Gracie, who was a studio musician. He was told by Goldsmith to, quote, play it sexy, but like it's not good sex.
The opening of the credits for the movie, there's an initial sound which kind of creates the atmosphere of the picture. I don't know what causes that, how he created that. You don't really hear it other than echoes of it throughout the film, but it really draws you in.
I have to look that up and see what instrument or what he used to do that.
You hear that, you see the way the credits are, which actually are kind of beautifully done, and you know that you're into something different and something special.
Exactly. Roger Ebert added it to his great movies list, saying that Nicholson's performance was key in keeping Chinatown from becoming just a genre crime picture, along with Town's screenplay, concluding that the film, quote, seems to settle easily beside the original noirs. And Variety said, Chinatown is an outstanding picture. Robert Towne's complex but literate and orderly screenplay takes gumshoe Jack Nicholson on a murder manhunt all over the Los Angeles of 35 years ago. Roman Polanski's American-made film, first since Rosemary's Baby, shows him again in total command of talent and physical filmmaking element. However, Vincent Canby of the New York Times was not impressed with the screenplay. He's saying, Mr. Polanski and Mr. Towne have attempted nothing so witty and entertaining, being content instead to make a completely stylish, more or less 30-ish movie that continually made me wish I were back seeing The Maltese Falcon or The Big Sleep. But you can't please everybody. With that, here's some more information about the movie. It cost $6 million to make and made $29 million at the box office. It was nominated for 11 Academy Awards, including Picture, Director, Actor, Actress, winning for Best Original Screenplay. This was the year of Godfather Part 2. It also received 11 BAFTA nominations and won for Best Film, Director, Picture, and Screenplay. The Godfather Part 2 didn't open until the following year in England, and I don't think it won Best Picture then either. In 1991, the film was selected by the Library of Congress for preservation in the United States National Film Registry as being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. In Hollywood, the movie's line, "Forget it, Jake, it's Chinatown," has become a mantra for those who have been burned or snubbed by the entertainment industry. Implication being that it's better to let it go than to make an issue of it, because that's just how the industry works. According to IMDb, LA's original Chinatown was demolished between 1933 and 1936 to make way for Union Station. The current Chinatown, located a few blocks away, opened in 1938. So the only time LA had no official Chinatown was 1937, the year in which this film is set. Rance Howard, who plays the role of an angry farmer at the council meeting, is the father of Ron Howard. Bruce Glover, who plays Duffy, one of Jake's colleagues in the agency, is the father of Crispin Glover. C.O. Erickson, the film's executive producer, plays the banker in the barbershop who starts an argument with Jake. And Faye Dunaway's character, Evelyn Mulray, drives a 1938 Packard 12 convertible Victoria, but the film is set in 1937, as the newspaper shows in the barbershop scene. Another oopsie. With that, let's get to my selection. That is The Third Man. However, first we are going to take a moment and listen to a promo from a fellow podcaster. And while you are doing that, be sure to follow, like, or comment on the podcast.
Hey, I'm Aaron.
And I'm Abe.
And together, we host
Out Now with Aaron and Abe.
Hey, we pulled that off.
Hey.
This is a weekly review show, right? We talk about movies on a weekly basis.
And other things.
Yeah, we have commentary tracks. We have lots of guests.
A lot of bonus episodes, a lot of game talk, a lot of sports talk.
Yeah, somehow sports talk factors in there, along with Simpsons references for whatever reason.
So give us a listen. We're everywhere podcasts are found.
Yeah, they're everywhere, right?
Everywhere.
Out Now with Aaron and Abe.
Coming live.
Sometimes? I
think
think it's in there. I can edit that together.
Welcome back. First, some information about the film. The Third Man is a British noir released in 1949. It was directed by Carol Reed and written by Graham Greene. Graham Greene did write a treatment of the story in preparation for writing the screenplay, which was later released as a novella. It stars Orson Welles, Joseph Cotten, Alida Vallee, Trevor Howard, Paul Horbiger, Ernst Deutsch, Eric Ponto, Siegfried Brauer, Hedwig Bleibtreu, Bernard Lee, and Wilfred Hyde White. In post-World War II occupied Vienna, poor American author of cheap novelettes, Holly Martins, arrives having been invited by his old friend, Harry Lime, who has a job waiting for him. But Holly reaches Lime's flat, only to find out that Lime was killed a few days before after being hit by a car. It soon becomes clear that there is something not right about the death, and Holly begins to investigate against the better judgment of an English major and Lime's girlfriend. But he is right, something is off as Holly comes to learn how dark and soulless life can be. What do you think of the pairing of the two films? What are their similarities, their differences? How do you think they work together?
Well, I think they're an excellent, and they're both truly great films. You know, they both deal with the fact that it's Chinatown. You pointed out earlier, the corruption, the forces functioning in the netherworld are not understood or appreciated on some level, cannot overcome. And both of them deal with unthinkable evil, which reveals itself gradually as the detective hack writer go off in a variety of different directions, but ultimately finding out, to a certain extent at least, what's going on. In the case of The Third Man, it's one of the classic films, certainly one of the very best British. There are some good ones. I love a great deal about The Third Man. Try to see it whenever it happens to be in the theaters on a repertory basis. And I first saw it in Wisconsin, weekend screenings of other films of that era. It became one of my favorites.
See, I agree with everything you say. They are sort of epitomes of the noir genre. And one of the comparisons is that both had their endings changed, but we'll talk about that later. They're both noir and they both have some of the same themes. But they could also be looked at the context of the time. And you actually talked about this some when we were talking about Chinatown, because Chinatown came out when existentialism hit American movies and became the driving force of New Hollywood. What America was and represented was thrown into doubt because of Vietnam and civil rights, the assassinations and Nixon. People were paranoid and distrustful of those in authority. The Third Man comes with the death of modernism and the rise of existentialism and nihilism. But America, it was going through an existential crisis at the time, but it didn't really know that's what was going on. And film noir sort of grows out of that something's going on under the surface and nobody quite knows what it is. But in the 60s and 70s, when Chinatown came out, they knew. But in The Third Man, America thought, like Holly Martin's, that mankind could still solve all their own problems. Evil could be overcome. The Third Man can almost be seen as a metaphor of a naive U.S. losing its innocence during the war. Modernism pretty much ended as a philosophy with the bombing of Hiroshima. When it comes to Chinatown, this was no longer the modernist period where the bad guys lose and the good guys win. The 1945 movie Scarlet Street was the first film the code came in where a murderer got away with his crime. But it really wasn't until the New Hollywood came out that the bad guys really started getting away with it. The Godfather, The Hot Rock, The Thomas Crown Affair, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. All of a sudden, the bad guys were winning. Take it a step further. I quoted Simon Wiesenthal saying, "For evil to flourish, it only requires that good men do nothing." But Jake, who's basically a good man, an anti-hero, but he's basically a good person, did do something and only made things worse. So in Chinatown, we're left with a sort of nihilism that was taking over the U.S. And The Third Man, a good man, did do something and help good get rid of evil. So we're now going from a morally appropriate endings in The Third Man into Chinatown, where even trying to do what's right can end in a bad way. You mentioned when you first saw the film. I have no idea when I first saw it. It was probably in college like you. I do believe I saw it with original narration by Joseph Cotten, which was used in the American version as opposed to the Carol Reed narration used in the British version. And this would also have been the version where the dancer at the club with the pasties would have been censored as well. But after that, I think I've only seen the original British version with Carol Reed and 11 minutes put back in. And of course, for me, like Chinatown, it is one of the greatest films ever made, perhaps the greatest British film ever made, depending on where you put films like Lawrence of Arabia. So what are some of your favorite scenes?
Certainly the scene where you first spot Harry Lime.
Yes.
Is terrific. You kind of know because the cat only is attracted to Harry, as pointed out earlier. Even so, it's surprising and shocking in kind of a pleasing way. Now you know something about this character, that he's not dead. Of course, the last scene, Valley walking past the Joseph Cotten character, is one of the best ending scenes, not unlike the ending scene of Chinatown. And one thing that's kind of interesting is that in both those ending scenes, the filmmaker brings together many of the characters from the movie for the denouement. And that's kind of an interesting effect, an appropriate one, I think, for both movies. I really love the scene where Holly Martins thinks that he's being kidnapped and he ends up being delivered to give his talk and then gives one of the most boring talks.
Yes.
It sort of reminded me of real life, where you bring in an author or a lecturer or an expert on something dreadfully dull. It's permeated by the zither music throughout. The use of that music in a clever way highlight what is the counter to what's going. And then, of course, all of the angled cinematography and all of the shots being set in such a way that there's just a feeling of uneasiness and anxiety throughout the entire picture.
I certainly agree with all of that. The discovery that Lime is alive when someone opens the window is sometimes described as the greatest introduction of a character in film history. My scenes are what are generally considered some of the most people's favorites. The Ferris wheel scene, of course, final chase through the sewers. But I like this little scene where the porter says that Lime is either in heaven and he points down, or in hell and he points up, which sort of sums up Austria at the time.
Right.
What are your thoughts on Kel Reed, who is the director? Are you familiar with him? Do you have a favorite film of his? I assume it's got to be this one.
It is. And
Yeah.
I also like The Fallen Idol. Did he win the Academy Award for Oliver?
Yes.
You know, I'm not a big fan. I guess it was a movie of its time, but he had a long career. I think the high point of his career aesthetically may be The Fallen Idol.
I think you're very right. And add to that the odd man out. So in many ways, his reputation rests on those three. And after that, his films weren't always quite as interesting. They're very watchable. They're sometimes very entertaining. I like Oliver more than you do, but yes, it's not what his early films are. So he reached this high point in The Thin Man, and though he's a very good and very solid director, his career doesn't really build up from that. For both Polanski and Reed, these films may be the apex of their career, followed by a downward spiral. But his direction here is superb. I mean, he makes the most of that war-torn city and brings out the evil and paranoia and suspicion. It's known for the use of Dutch angles, where the camera goes at an angle and you don't see things straight on and parallel angle, and it keeps throwing off the equilibrium. It's an odd thing to call it a Dutch angle because there's nothing Dutch about it. The word Dutch is a bastardization of the word Deutsch, the German word for German, because it was used in German films during the silent era. Over the years, people have tried to give Welles a lot of credit for the movie and for the making of the film and for its success. Where do you fall on that?
I think he had less impact on the overall film and the choices that were made in terms of the music, the cinematography, the story. Where he had an influence, he's so charismatic in the villain. Even though you don't see him until well into the movie, the whole movie's about him. Anticipation of the mystery is, but I do not fall on the really kind of sub rosa did this picture.
I certainly agree. He didn't direct any of it. Some people say he wrote much of the dialogue, but he only wrote one line of dialogue, and that is the famous one about cuckoo clocks and Switzerland. This came about, according to Green, because they needed an extra line of dialogue for a transition in the scene, and Wells came up with it, but it should be noted that he didn't make it up, but he paraphrased another artist, many thinking it was James Whistler. In This Is Orson Welles in 1993, Welles said, quote, "When the picture came out, the Swiss very nicely pointed out to me that they never made any cuckoo clocks, and the cuckoo clocks are native to the German Black Forest." And then writer John McPhee also said that when the Borgias flourished in Italy, Switzerland had, quote, "the most powerful and feared military force in Europe and was not the peacefully neutral country it later became." So not only did he steal this line, he was totally wrong about everything he said in it.
That's fascinating.
Because Wellesians couldn't support their thesis that he had a lot to do with it, they then turned to saying that without the movies of Orson Welles, especially Citizen Kane, The Stranger and the Lady from Shanghai, the movie would not have existed. But I don't agree, and I think that's too simple. For me, the lighting and cinematography were more influenced by German Expressionism, which was brought over by German artist fleeing Hitler. This became the dominant style of black and white films of that era. The Dutch angle certainly not Wellesian. In fact, the movie doesn't really remind me of Welles at all in look and style. Citizen Kane itself was heavily influenced by Hitchcock's Rebecca, and I see a lot more Hitchcock in the movie than Welles and the general rise of film noir overall at the time. You even mentioned the scene where he suddenly finds himself at this lecture that he's supposed to give, which is very reminiscent of the 39 Steps, where the guy finds himself at this political rally and has to give a speech, though he gives a very good speech. In fact, Time magazine wrote at the time that the film was, quote, "crammed with cinematic plums that would do the early Hitchcock crowd. Ingenious twists and turns of plot, subtle detail, full-bodied bit characters, atmospheric backgrounds that became an intrinsic part of the story. A death commingling of the sinister, the ludicrous, the casual with the bizarre." And Kel Reed, for a while, many people said, was becoming the new Alfred Hitchcock of Britain. Once Hitchcock came to the U.S. and became an American citizen, Kel Reed was thought to be the one who's going to replace him, though it never quite seemed to work. I also want to point out that the treatment of women is very different here. Green tended to see women in terms of romantic connections to men. Their lives tended to be defined by their love for a man and nothing else. for better or for worse, often for worse for the man, not always for the woman. He's not brutal to women in his books and his writings, but there is something really misogynistic about it. He almost defines that a woman knows they're in love with the man because he gives them an orgasm, and they're not in love with their husbands because they don't.
Graham Greene's a subject unto himself.
Right.
I've read most of his coda, and he is hung up a lot on obsessive romance and also his own Catholicism, the guilt he felt with respect to relationships he had outside of marriage, the relationship he had with his own wife. There's all sorts of things going on there, but it deals a lot with his various books. This, The Third Man, which was never really a novel, was intended for the screen, is less fixated on those psychological browbeat issues that he dealt with in many of his books, and is more of a sophisticated thriller, much more entertaining as a result.
Well, he did have two kinds of books, the serious one and the entertainment.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And this would fall more under the entertainment, though today, when it comes to quality, they're all lumped together. People don't consider the serious ones necessarily any better than the entertainments. But you're right, this is more of an entertainment. But there is a spiritual backdrop to his film. He converted to Catholicism after he met his future wife, but he later described himself as a Catholic agnostic, though he did take last rites as he was dying. And his books were known for probing religious and political conflicts of the time. He was also a communist sympathizer and became quite anti-American. And speaking of all his affairs, the rumor is the reason why he never won the Nobel Prize, though he was shortlisted numerous times, is because he was having an affair with the wife of one of the people on the board who chooses the winners. You have to have a unanimous vote to win the prize. And that person said, as long as I'm on this board, Graham Greene will never win.
That certainly could influence a vote.
Yes. Orson Welles' character Harry Lime talks about believing in God, but basically he says, what does it matter? Because we're all ants. And the world would just come out of was a war where God seemed to be absent, and people were treating each other as nothing but ants and squash. I think there still is a moral background, more sense of what is good and evil in The Third Man than opposed to Chinatown. But this is where I come back to this line about Evelyn's eye. And she says that there's a flaw in the iris, that Christians believe in original sin, that we are born with evil inside us. And in Chinatown, Jake sees this odd thing in Evelyn's eye, and I always interpreted it as being symbolic of original sin. People might not believe in God during the 60s and 70s and 80s, but they believed in sin.
Well, it was a fascinating period in history. I mean, Hollywood was dramatic changes in terms of the subject matter and the style of filmmaking. Studio system dissipated in the 50s with Paramount Case and other sorts of influences like television first time. Now, as you go into the 1970s, you have the Manson murders, Sharon Tate and others, which really changed Los Angeles and changed Hollywood. Prior to that, of a company town. With the Manson murders, initially, no one had it happen. This came out of nowhere. Although if you read the history of Manson, you can kind of see how his striving to be part of Hollywood and the music business really kind of a cruelly logical process goes through to mass murders. But everybody was suspicious of everybody. Handgun sales went way up. Guard dogs in Los Angeles went from being a company town to a place where nobody trusted anyone. And then, of course, while Chinatown was being made and being released, the Watergate hearings presented corruption at the highest levels of government, something that may have existed in the past from time to was now televised. This is also on the heels of and wrong-headed war. So there was a lot of stuff going on at that time when Chinatown's made, which made everybody uncomfortable, in some cases willing to take more chances. There's a new freedom of cinema. Some of the best movies ever made during this period.
So The Third Man began with Alexander Korda having money in an Austrian bank that he wasn't allowed to take out of the country. So instead of years of legal battles, he decided to make a movie there and sent Greene ahead to figure out a story, which Greene was having difficulty doing until he met an intelligence officer who told him about the sewers, that the Russians refused to allow the exits to be closed or locked and about the sewer police, because they had a special police force that would watch the sewers. The officer then told Green about penicillin being diluted on the black market, and with that, Green wrote this treatment. But like Chinatown, the original screenplay had a different ending than the movie. In the screenplay, there's a suggestion of hope between Anna and Martins. She walks by him, he goes after her, and after a moment, she puts her arm through his. I've heard different things about how David O. Selznick, the American producer, felt about the ending, but it seems that Green was the only one who wanted a happy ending. Korda, Reed, and even Selznick wanted the unhappy one. It's really unusual that Selznick was in agreement on this because he loved happy endings. But Green later wrote, quote, "One of the very major disputes between Carol Reed and myself concerned the ending, and he has been proved triumphantly right."
Although I was under the impression that the femme fatale in The Third Man was never all that interested.
No, she never was. I'm not sure I would buy Anna putting her arms through this because after Harry Lime.
It made no sense.
Yeah. Once you've had Harry Lime, what can you do?
She was obsessed with it. On some level, it was a fairly typical Graham Greene love affair.
Exactly. Do you have a favorite performance? Oh, outside of Orson Welles, because I'm sure we both agree he just steals the movie.
He does indeed. I like, is it Bernard Lee?
Sergeant Payne, who was helping Calloway.
His performance, and that of Trevor Howard, the two policemen. I thought those were very believable, very solid. I was really sad when Bernard Lee character is killed. I kind of want him to survive. He's like such a really good person in the context of all sorts of morally and then of course there was really interesting pursuits by the characters who seemingly Harry away once he was quote killed. The Baron Kurtz, Dr. Winkle. I mean, those were again very solid, believable performances. Hitchcockian type character with their own kind of oddness, clearly up to no good.
I think my favorite supporting performance is the porter, Paul Herbiger, who first gives Holly Martins hints that something is wrong. And he's actually in some ways the unsung hero of the film. Because when Korda, Reed, and Green got to Austria, it's a war-torn city with people who hadn't seen an American film since the war started. They had no idea who any of these people were. They didn't know who Joseph Cotton and Orson Welles were. So none of these people's names were helping them get doors open for them. Paul Herbiger was a major Austrian star. So when they cast him, everybody in Vienna knew who he was. And they suddenly found all these doors being opened for them. He couldn't speak English. So all his lines are read phonetically in the movie. But you can't tell. And he gives a wonderful performance.
One thing was the use non-English dialogue throughout. There aren't subtitles for the most part, so you really don't know what people are saying, but you know what is being talked about. I always feel a film like this that uses the actual language of the era and the place is much more authentic. I'm not bothered by it particularly. In fact, quite the contrary. I really can be pulled into a place when I hear language I don't quite understand. And in this movie, I don't know how Carol Reed pulls it off. But again, you kind of know where things are going, even understand exactly what's being said.
Well, there is that one scene, which I also think is very Hitchcockian, where Holly Martins arrives back to find the porter dead. And he has no idea what everybody around him is saying. But we in the audience know.
Yes.
And then Anna knows what's going on and tries to get him away. But he's just standing there totally innocent, not having any idea that all these people around him are saying, you did it, you're responsible, you're it.
There's another really great performance, and that's the little boy.
Like Chinatown, we do have to talk about the cinematography and the music because both play such an important part. The cinematography was by Robert Rasker. He did a number of notable films, Brief Encounter, Henry V, Odd Man Out, and then went on to make some big budgeted epics, and he's a major British cinematographer. Some critics at the time criticized the use of the Dutch angles. C.A. Lejeune in The Observer described Reed's, quote, habit of printing his scenes askew with floors sloping at a diagonal and close-ups deliriously tilted as most distracting. An American director, William Wyler, who was Reed's close friend, set him a spirit level with a note stating, Carol, next time you make a picture, just put it on the top of the camera, will you? But the Dutch angles really make this film.
Absolutely. I really like what he did and what they all tried to do.
And he captures the war-torn Vienna perfectly, the German expressionism. While Chinatown cinematography is more postmodern nostalgia, The Third Man's is more realistic and modern. And then the zither music by Anton Karas. A lot of people on Facebook in my movie groups do not like this music. They say they find the movie difficult to watch because of it. Most people, of course, don't fall into that category. It's great.
It really is. And it's not only the music itself, but the way it's used. In some places being complementary to the action and what's going on, in other cases being in contrast. Sometimes the zither has sort of a humorous, light aspect, and it's intense.
Carol Reed heard Karas play at a party and found that to be the perfect kind of music he wanted because he didn't want schmaltzy waltzes, operetta music that Austria is known for. Film reviewer Roger Ebert wrote, "Has there ever been a film where the music more perfectly suited the action than Carol Reed's The Third Man?"
I love this music. Look forward to hearing it when I view the film.
When it was released in Austria, the local critics were underwhelmed, let us say. The film ran for only a few weeks. Still, the Viennese Arbeiterzeitung, although critical of a not too logical plot, praised the film's masterful depiction of a time out of joint. William Cook, after his 2006 visit to an 8-room museum in Vienna dedicated to the film, which I think shows you that Austria changed their mind about the film, wrote, "In Britain, it's a thriller about friendship and betrayal. In Vienna, it's a tragedy about Austria's troubled relationship with its past." It received great reviews in Britain and America. The big exception was The Daily Worker, the British Communist paper, which complained that, quote, "no effort is spared to make the Soviet authorities as sinister and unsympathetic as possible." Well, with that, here's some more information about the film. I don't have the information on how much it cost to make, but it made £277,549, which in 2021 is equivalent to £10,432,000. According to Kinematograph Weekly, it was the biggest winner at the box office in England in 1949. It received 3 Oscar nominations, Best Director, Film Editing, and it won for Best Cinematography, Black and White. It won Best British Film at the BAFTAs, and Carol Reed won the Palme d'Or at Cannes. The film was released in the U.S. in 1951, which was the year of All About Eve. In Britain in 1949, this was the year of The Bicycle Thieves. In 1999, the British Film Institute voted The Third Man the greatest British film of all time. In 2011, a poll of 150 actors, directors, writers, producers, and critics for Time Out ranked it the second best British film ever. I could be wrong, but I think Get Carter was the film that toppled it. I only say that because we covered Get Carter on Pop Art, and that's my memory. I had the son of the producer of Get Carter on the show. The Third Man theme spent 11 weeks at #1 on Billboard's U.S. bestseller in stores. Because of this, the film was advertised as the famous musical score by Anton Karas that would have the audience in a dither with his zither. He made so much money, he opened a nightclub in Vienna called The Third Man. When Selznick died, The Third Man's copyright was not renewed. It became the public domain in the U.S. It wasn't public domain in England, and the Supreme Court eventually ruled that the U.S. had to recognize Britain's copyright. So under current U.S. copyright law, The Third Man will remain copyrighted until January 1st, 2045. The British radio series The Adventures of Harry Lime, created as a prequel to the film, centers on Lime's adventures before his death in Vienna. A television spin-off starring Michael Rennie as Harold Lime ran for 5 seasons from 1959 to 1965. In Vienna, the film is played 3 times a week in the famous Bergkino Theater. The original script included a return appearance by Basil Ratford and Naughton Wayne. If people who are fans of Alfred Hitchcock know them to have played Charters and Caldecott in The Lady Vanishes. They had appeared in like 3 or 4 subsequent films as Charters and Caldecott because the characters were so beloved, especially Carol Reed's Night Train to Munich. However, the 2 characters were streamlined into the role of Mr. Craven, played by Wilfred Hyde White. Talking of James Bond, Bernard Lee, who played Sergeant Payne, played M in a number of Bond films. This is the film debut of Robert Brown, who played a British MP, who succeeded Lee in playing M. Geoffrey Keane, who played a military soldier, played the defense minister in some Bond films, and assistant director Guy Hamilton directed a few James Bond movies. That's a lot to have in one film. And it might be mentioned that Holly Martins in the opening walks under a ladder as he approaches Lime's building. And after that, everything goes downhill. So with that, let's start closing out. And I asked you to choose a film or two to go with your choice that might interest our audience.
Well, some fairly obvious choices contemporary would be L.A. Confidence and The Usual Suspects, which are two of my favorite films and are neo-noir. But I also am a big fan of older films like Maltese and The Killing, Out of the Past. And if you want to take another look at Joseph Cotten, a Hitchcock film, Shadow, one of my favorite films is The Asphalt Jungle. Casablanca is not considered a noir, as cinematography, doomed romance.
I have three. In Francis Ford Coppola's 1974 The Conversation, a surveillance expert played by Gene Hackman has an existential crisis when he records a conversation that leads him to think that two people may be murdered. Orson Welles and Joseph Cotten join forces again after Citizen Kane and the Magnificent Ambersons, Welles directing. In 1943's Journey into Fear, a ballistics expert finds himself threatened by Nazi agents. After being given safe passage home on a ship, he finds that the people after him are also on board. Alfred Hitchcock made two versions of the story, The Man Who Knew Too Much, in 1956 and 1934. As far as I'm concerned, the 1956 version is infinitely better. In it, a couple played by Jimmy Stewart and Doris Day witness a murder, and after the murderer whispers something in the Stewart's ear, their child is abducted and they are thrust into international intrigue. So what is next? What should we be expecting from you?
We're shooting the fourth season of a TV series called Lair. It's a supernatural series, vampires and werewolves and other characters of that ilk. We are doing a series of film noir pictures, looking at scripts that we both own, that we've acquired over the years, including one of yours.
Thank you. I was hoping you'd say that, but...
Well, it's a script. We like film noir. We make sure in many cases we have gay characters in them because that's part of our audience. And so, we shape things. We did the Donald Strachey Mysteries. We'd like to do more, which is a gay detective, really well received.
But yes, the Donald Strachey films are a lot of fun. They're very thin man.
Well, that's another good group of pictures. Are fun to watch, certainly. Yep. We did something called 100 Years of Men in Love, the Accidental Collection. That has won a lot of awards, and it's a documentary directed by David Milburn. David is Paul Collishman's life partner and started out as an actor, has evolved to the point where he's an excellent producer, runs our studio. He's become an amazing executive. He's relentless as a producer, and because we make things for very modest budgets or reasonable budgets, he directed this picture, and essentially two young gay men who, not as young anymore, but they came upon a photo of two men together 50, 60 years ago, and you could tell it was more than just a couple of friends. And they thought that would be the only photo they'd find, and they found another. And over the years, they collected these photos. They're amazing. We're taken by yourself as gay. They put together a book, and from that book, David adapted that to a documentary film, and people have been touched by it, both gay and straight. Women respond to it very, very, because it's about love.
That's great. That's fantastic. I'll list my usual litany. I'm a screenwriter and script consultant, and you can find more information about that on my Howard Casner Screenplay Consultation page on Facebook. My blog is called Rantings and Ravings, and there I explore issues on film and screenwriting. I have published 2 books of short stories on Amazon, The Starving Artist and Other Stories, and The 5 Corporations and One True Religion. These are sci-fi, supernatural, and fantasy short stories. I've also published the 2nd edition of my screenwriting book, More Rantings and Ravings of a Screenplay Reader, and I'm an amateur photographer, and you can find those on Instagram. The previous episode was with Anna Kaiser and Derek DeHankey of the 80s Movie Montage podcast, where we talked 2 comedies about basic training, Stripes, and what many people might consider their grandfather's version of Stripes, No Time for Sergeants. For the next episode, I will welcome podcaster and film lover David Brooke, where we will talk Master and Commander, The Far Side of the World, and The Enemy Below, 2 films about 2 warships playing cat and mouse. So once again, thank you, Stephen, for being a guest on my show.
Thank you for inviting me. I really